What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Kyle Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR, coming to you weekly with some Philly sports talk. Today I got some Flyers talk and some Eagles talk for you. Then a special guest in the second segment. We got Tyler Zulli of All PHLY coming in. Tyler's a former Fanatic producer, and we're going to talk some Philly sports, of course, but Tyler's also a Penn State grad, and I wouldn't trust many other people with college football more than I trust him. So he's coming in at the perfect time because I'm really intrigued at the Penn State-Notre Dame matchup in the college football playoffs. But really, I want to ask him about something a little more interesting about this matchup, and that's how it's perceived in the Philadelphia area. But before we get to Tyler, let's start with some Flyers talk. And I got two quick topics to touch on. The first one is goaltending, because what else is new? There's something in the water in Philadelphia, as John Tortorella said last week.
As I've said, the goaltending situation, I said it at the beginning of the year, and I'll say it now, it's been forced into a situation that we really didn't want because we're still evaluating Urs. We're evaluating Feds and Coley. We still don't know what it is, and we're trying to win games. So we'll see where it goes. It's not supposed to be this way. It's not supposed to be this way with Urs. Urs fell off last year. A number of other things fell off with our team, but Urs did too, and no one expected the wrench to be thrown in. As we just talked about, it's years of planning the most important position in your hockey team, goaltending. It's the water in Philly or something happens that everything gets screwed up. No one expected Carter leaving and forcing Urs into this situation. Then it's just a domino effect with these other guys. And we got two other guys in the wings, I think, in the organization. I'm not sure where it all goes, but it is what it is, and we got to deal with it.
So it is what it is, John. Well, it is really bad. It's been just short of a year since Carter Hart left the team. It was January 23rd, 2024 was the first game they played without Hart on the team. And I tweeted out the stats of each Flyers goaltender since that happened. So you can get the full numbers on my Twitter at The New Beginnings, but I'm going to run through the list pretty quickly. It's Sam Ersson with 48 games, Alexei Kolosov with 15. The chart I tweeted has Ivan Fedotov with 13. He's since started 2 more games, so he's also at 15 and done decently in those 2. But the bigger picture obviously still stands. And then you got smaller sample sizes from Felix Sandstrom with 5 starts and Cal Peterson with 3. But the save percentage of those goaltenders is all below 880. Sam Ersson is at 879, and he's the highest. The NHL averages this year are all the way down, and there's been a lot of studies as to why that is, but the average is still 900, and Sam Ersson is at 879 over the past year. All of his backups are way lower, and the worst number that I encountered in all this statistical analysis here, Flyers goaltenders are negative 52 in goals saved above expected, and that's considered pretty much the top analytical stat in goaltending in the modern NHL. So these numbers are just glaringly bad. You don't get away with goaltending that is this bad if you want to be a playoff team, and especially if you have self-admitted talent deficiencies in your roster like the Flyers do. I've already talked about Alexei Kolosov. If you want to go back to December, and you can also find that on my social media pages and on 975thefanatic.com. I put together an easy case why he shouldn't even be on the NHL roster. He wouldn't be if there wasn't the threat that he runs back overseas, goes to Russia in the KHL or Belarus, whatever it is that they're afraid of him doing. But that was one thing when Alexei Kolosov was playing at least comparable to Fedotov as the backup behind Ersson. Alexei Kolosov, since I published that, has been terrible. The struggles, the inexperience at the NHL level has caught up to him way more than I initially pointed out. And Ivan Fedotov is not really looking like a legitimate contributor over a long period of time at the NHL level. They signed this guy to a pretty significant 2-year contract at $6.5 million. So I guess they're stuck with him for the rest of this season and next, but I just don't see how at this point the front office could possibly consider him a big building block for the organizational rebuild. So Sam Ersson better be healthy, because that's just general competence in goal. I know I said he had a bad save percentage, and the stats are definitely not telling a good story with him, but I do think he's an NHL goaltender, maybe not as highly rated as the Flyers hoped coming into this season, but he's the best option that they have. He's still listed as day-to-day. You don't know what's going to happen. His long-term availability is probably a concern, but if the Flyers are going to make the playoffs, he needs to get healthy, and he needs to have at least an average second half of the season here. And in that sound clip I just played, John Tortorella mentioned the prospects coming in. That's Igor Zavragin and Carson Bjarnason. Zavragin is a higher-rated prospect, at least from most of the projections I see. I never pretend to be a prospect expert, by the way. I don't watch film on these guys. I go with secondhand information. But Bjarnason is supposed to turn pro next season, probably a better option in Lehigh Valley. Zavragin, Briere said on The Fanatic in July with Kevin Cooney that he's about 3 years away from his NHL rookie season. Goaltender development takes longer than other positions do, than forwards and defensemen do, and this is a long process. So just to say that they have goalies in the pipeline is not really giving you the best pulse on where the Flyers are at as far as their organizational timeline. I think it's just kind of a sentiment in NHL team building that it's harder to draft and develop goalies. And one of the elements of that, sometimes GMs don't want to take goalies, especially in the first round or probably the earlier rounds collectively, because a lot of times the amount of development and the process it takes outlasts whatever GM made the pick. So a lot of times you're drafting a goaltender to benefit your own replacement 4 or 5 years down the road. Whoever comes in after you is going to bear the fruits of the pick that you made. And Jeff Marek gives the slick industry joke, an NHL GM drafted a goalie and someday he hopes to meet him. Well, obviously that's supposed to be a little bit of a hyperbole, but I think it really does represent the sentiment. So keep that in mind when you hear about the goaltender prospect pipeline. You can be optimistic about it. You can see Igor Zavragin making crazy saves over in the KHL on social media, but until these guys actually come over and become legitimate NHL goaltenders, you really don't know what's going to happen. Goaltending won't be the focus of this upcoming weekend, though, because you got Cutter Gauthier coming to town. Yeah, that Cutter Gauthier, who forced a trade out of Philly before he ever made it to the NHL. Think of it as one step further than J.D. Drew with the Phillies, because at least J.D. Drew said it before he got drafted. He had Scott Boras representing him as his agent, and he told the Phillies not to draft him. Cutter Gauthier, he got taken 5th overall by the Flyers back in 2022. He was excited to be a Flyer at the time. I think a lot of the resentment from the Flyers' point of view is based on the fact that they drafted him, and then afterwards he quickly changed his mind about wanting to join the organization. They presented a very united message of how Cutter Gauthier just felt entitled. He felt entitled to an NHL roster spot. That was reported by Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet up in Canada. But the major leaders of the organization, Danny Briere, Keith Jones, Dan Hilferty, these guys all went on the record and talked about how Cutter Gauthier just wouldn't budge. They kind of reached a point where they weren't going to rationalize with this guy anymore. They weren't going to try to convince him to think otherwise and stay with the Flyers. They got to the point where they thought they needed to move him. That was the public messaging, and they actually took some crap for it from the league-wide NHL media, who said that they were throwing this guy under the bus. And I believe that it was a calculated strategy. Think about how Philadelphia sports organization have taken this habit of pandering in recent seasons. Look no further than Bryce Harper and the stuff that he pulls to get the Philadelphia fans on his side. I think it's harmless, by the way. I'm not really going to crush Bryce Harper for it. I'm pointing it out more as a matter of fact. Over the past year, I've come to think of this a little bit differently. So why don't you take a listen to everyone in the organization crushing this kid?
Tim Saunders in the booth with Todd Fedoruk and Flyers general manager Danny Briere. Flyers announced that they have traded the draft rights of Cutter Gauthier to Anaheim. Is it true that we're hearing Cutter made clear he didn't want to play in Philadelphia?
He just refused, would not engage, would not listen to us, would not take a phone call, would not meet with us at all. It's a player that had changed his mind because at the draft the previous year he looked at us in the eye and told us, I'm built to be a Flyer, I want to be a Flyer. We believed him, and then a few months later he changed his mind and told us he didn't want to be a Flyer anymore. So at first we thought he'll change his mind again, and we tried to protect him and try to keep this thing quiet. Unfortunately it never did.
We had a new regime, we had new people in many different places, including changing our entire player development, adding Patrick Sharp and John LeClaire, players and former players of that ilk that demand respect, are people that I believe are young players coming up that are our property can look up to. They were all new. I figured as a group we would be able to convince the young man that Philadelphia was the right place for him to play. Unfortunately, we were unable to even present that message to the player. That was of complete frustration for me, something I haven't experienced for, the opportunity to let somebody know what you're all about. Fortunately, we were not given that opportunity.
But I think when you start rejecting calls from guys like John LeClaire and Patrick Sharp, it speaks a lot about your character and who you are as a person and what you came from. He looked like a prima donna and a baby.
The only thing that I had heard was the developments and not wanting to be there. So obviously, as a player in this locker room, that was something that stayed with us for as long as I know. Show up to development camp, whether you skate or not. So I think I said if he doesn't want to be here, we're happy to move on.
Want to play here in Philadelphia and didn't want to play for the Flyers. What's your reaction to that?
Then we don't want you.
So you heard different realms of the organization represented there. Most of that audio is on The Fanatic. You had the front office guys, Danny Briere and Keith Jones, doing interviews on the air. You had the alumni with Chris Terry, and that was on the pregame show before Gauthier faced the Flyers out in Anaheim on the Disney on Ice trip. And then the final audio, you had the current player, Travis Sanheim, talking about development camp and how he thought it was entitled that Gauthier did not show up. And, of course, the head coach, John Tortorella, that was in general media availability. The final two, Tortorella and Sanheim, were. I love the passion, and over the past year, I've heard other people around the arena just talk about how all of this went down, and also heard employees of the organization talk about how the U.S. national team development players, maybe they have a collective sense of entitlement, and that happened, again, another instance over the summer. Rucker McGroarty, a former teammate of Cutter Gauthier, he got traded from Winnipeg, and he forced out before he reached the NHL. That's another first-round pick forcing a trade. This is not common in the NHL. Some guys, they'll let their draft rights expire, but these guys have taken this to a real extreme, and I don't think it sat well with everybody, and it certainly didn't sit well with the Flyers if all of these people are going on the record and trashing this kid as much as they have. And I think it speaks volumes that a lot of the particular things that have been said have to do with that treatment of John LeClair and Patrick Sharp. These are two very accomplished NHL players, and I think what he did is he kind of upset the balance of respect from player to player. This is a guy who hasn't accomplished anything in the league, and he kind of pushed himself out of that inner circle that current players and former players kind of abide by, this idea of respect for the guys that came before you. And when you push LeClair and Sharp to the side, you're really not abiding by that at all. But I love the passion coming from within the organization, and that's what's going to come out on Saturday night from the fan base. Flyers fandom hasn't had the craziest passion in recent seasons. There hasn't been enough playoff hockey. The best team this franchise has had over the past decade played in the playoff bubble, so you didn't even have an opportunity for fans to get to the stadium and show that passion. But I think Cutter Gauthier hit the worst nerve that you can possibly hit for a Philadelphia sports fan. He had the audacity to act like Philadelphia isn't the greatest city in the history of the universe. Philadelphia sports fans take that one personally. Flyers fans and every other fan base in the area is characterized by this close-knit feeling that's almost like a family. This idea of, I'm allowed to criticize my team, but you're not. That's why every single time a national media member rips a Philadelphia team or a Philadelphia athlete, people in this area get up in arms about it as if it was an egregious misperception. So Flyers fans, head down to the Wells Fargo Center on Saturday night. Don't throw anything on the ice. Don't do anything else over the top. Respect the line. Don't embarrass the city. However, show the passion that characterizes Philadelphia sports on the weekend of a home Eagles playoff game and bring the heat that has been missing from Flyers fandom for far too long. So I'm expecting a big weekend down in South Philadelphia, but we are going to hit on the main story. Let's get it back to the Eagles. They end up with a wild card Sunday afternoon matchup against the Green Bay Packers, and there's some good history there. That was my weekly piece on 975thefanatic.com. You can check it out in the show notes. Every Eagles-Packers game in NFL playoff history. And there's a lot of memories there. The 4th and 26 game was the strongest for me. That's one of the best Eagles games I've ever watched. And just going back and seeing the highlights of that game on YouTube, I remember just how crazy it was, getting down 14-0, making the comeback, but needing that final drive, and McNabb firing the strike to Freddie Mitchell, which was a terrible spot by the officials, but hey, if you run back to the line and spike the ball, there's nothing anybody can do. But I want to focus less on the game this week in the sense of a matchup breakdown and more on the Eagles season as a whole. I think you got to contrast it to certain other seasons that I glorify, like thinking of 2004, 2017, and 2022, because those are the three best teams I've ever seen. This season was a little bit different. You had that 2-2 start before the bye week. You had all the Nick Sirianni drama, and I was so out on Nick Sirianni. I still have a lot of questions about him. But I guess this season, it's kind of more like that 2003 team. That was the 4th and 26 year. That team started 2-3, and it was another instance where it felt like the sky was falling. Take that how you wish, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, that it's like that 2003 season, because they lost in the NFC Championship game. They were favored at home against the Panthers, but they did go on a decent run. They won a playoff game there, that legendary performance against Green Bay, and I think the Eagles have another run in them. They're possibly on a collision course with the Detroit Lions. I think that's the likeliest NFC Championship game matchup, is for both of those teams to advance. But I'm confident in the Eagles independent from a matchup standpoint, just in an overall outlook on this team. And in other seasons, I've been able to say that the Eagles have gone on a run. So buckle up for a crazy month in the city of Philadelphia, but we'll switch gears on the gridiron with some Penn State Notre Dame talk after the break.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Colin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. And we got our guest, Tyler Zulli of All PHLY Sports. What's going on, Tyler?
What's up, Colin? How's everything going with you?
Going great. Thanks for giving a few minutes to us. Tyler's a former producer at 97.5 The Fanatic. That's how we met. And he's doing work over here, got his own Penn State show. You want to tell everybody where you can find that?
Yeah, of course. You can go to allphly.com. You can find us on YouTube for with PHLY Sports. A lot of fun going on with a lot of fun things going on with PHLY. And yes, I'm on the All Nittany Lion podcast with former Penn State players Jason Cabinda and Adam Telefero. So a really awesome, fun season. Kind of unexpected to still be talking about meaningful games at this point, but I think a lot of us as Penn State fans and those that cover the team. It's been a lot of fun. We've had a blast with this podcast so far.
It's excellent, and especially when I found out you were working with Telefero. That was one of the big stories when I was a kid, so was shocked to hear it, but I'm glad it's all working out, and you can get Tyler's links to his coverage in the show notes. So we'll get some Philly sports talk in too, because that's what this show's really about. But I want to start with a little bit of a change-up. Tyler's coming in as our college football expert. And first of all, I want to talk about something that I am absolutely fascinated with in the concept of fandom in Philadelphia sports. It's the weirdest fan dynamic I have ever seen. It's college football, because this is a professional sports market, especially with the Eagles being as big as they are. But Tyler, please tell me, if someone who knows nothing about the dynamic that I'm talking about wanders to Philadelphia, how do you explain college rooting interests to this city's Philadelphia sports fans?
Yeah, it's like the most wild west decision making, because you're right. It is a pro football town. It's a pro sports town through and through. I mean, I know obviously Temple football plays at the Link, and they've had their share of difficulties over the last couple of years, really since that 2016 team that was just so darn good. But there's no true blue blood kind of attachment team for a lot of people in Philly. So it's, who did your parents grow up rooting for? Who did a family member or a sibling, where did they go to school? So there are a lot of Penn State fans in the Philadelphia area, and especially in the Northeast Philly area, but there's also a lot of Notre Dame fans. There's also a lot of college football fans. There's also a lot of fans who just say, I like the game of football. I don't have a team. I went to, a Westchester, or I went to a Lehigh, or, schools that have programs, but not at the FBS level, that they kind of just latch on to a team when they were a kid, or who their older siblings rooted for, or who their parents rooted for. It's really kind of an awesome dynamic, because you run into people who say, I grew up rooting for Penn State. I grew up rooting for Notre Dame. I grew up rooting for, Florida, or, UCLA or USC. I'm just naming random teams,
right.
Because you just find, people across the city who just kind of attached to a team and a fan base. Some maybe even did it because it's who they started playing with in, NCAA football when they were kids, right? It's so cool to talk to people and find out who they root for and why they root for them, because there's really no true latch-on team in this city that's so predicated on pro sports.
Sure, I'm a Temple grad, and that doesn't actually mean what you probably think it means. I've never really looked at Penn State as the rival because they've always been so much better than Temple. I grew up kind of introduced to Penn State as the home team. I was a fan, and I still maintain an interest. But the dynamic of Penn State alums, and there are some Notre Dame alums in this area, with the proximity, it's obviously a lot fewer, but yeah, the dynamic that you're talking about from Delco and Northeast Philly, people get up in arms about it. Very happy to hear that your experience is positive with it.
Yeah, I think that, of course, there's going to be – I think those are probably the two teams that are not of the area. You know, obviously Penn State's closer, 3 hours away, but it's not – you know, it's not in your backyard. And then Notre Dame, there's a lot of people that, again, grew up rooting for them, whether it be because of they were the team that was readily available on TV and on radio prior to that in the city. And Penn State, of course, has, you know, semi-local ties, and there's a lot of kids on this Penn State roster that grew up in the area where, you know, in the Philly areas, in the Philly suburbs, in the Jersey area, you know, right across the bridge in any one direction. So I do think that those are probably the two teams that stand out as like the dynamic choices for the Philadelphia area fan that doesn't necessarily have an alumni base to go back to. And so I think it's so funny that these two teams are the you know, one of these two teams is going to play for a national championship in a couple of days, because it really is a rivalry without being a rivalry, because it's more about the fans, you know, the rooting interest amongst themselves than it is the teams themselves. Because like you bring up Temple, Penn State's in a weird spot where they're almost rivalry-less, if that makes any sense, because, you know, they entered the Big Ten late. They're the 11th team in the Big Ten. Penn State fans want to say that Ohio State's their rival. Ohio State doesn't view them in the same light. It's Ohio State and Michigan. You know, so you're talking about, is Michigan State a rival? Is Maryland the rival? Is there a non-conference team? Like, could you reignite a rivalry with Pitt? So Penn State feels like, you know, they don't really have a true rival, so they can kind of almost like take in all of the opposition's vitriol, if you will, and use it as bulletin board material, because Penn State was an independent team for a long time. And, you know, they joined the Big Ten as the 11th team. There are 742 teams in the Big Ten now. But, you know, for the most part, they're kind of without a rival within their own conference. So they can kind of take all of this and say, hey, whatever we need to use as bulletin board material, we will.
And someday, just someday, I pray that these universities figure out a way to put Penn State and Pitt back on Thanksgiving weekend. But let's get to the game. And my real storyline of intrigue here is James Franklin, because both of these teams, you can say, but I'm going to focus more on Penn State, has been in that second tier of college football in recent seasons. You have the SEC powerhouses, Bama, Georgia, and Ohio State and Michigan too. Ohio State's still on the other side of the bracket, but a lot of these bigger teams are out. Penn State and Notre Dame trying to jump from that second tier. But Tyler, is James Franklin good enough to come up big here and put Penn State in the national championship game?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that the conversation around James Franklin has been fair, you know, for the most part, where the conversation was, what's his record against top 10 teams?
Right.
It's not very good in his career. And that's probably because, as you mentioned, Penn State is that second tier team, which is to say they're a great team. They're not in the elite tier as the Ohio State, as the Bama, as the Georgia. They're looking to get into that tier. And I think with the changing landscape of college football, with the, you know, NIL deals and the transfer portals, and I think they have the flexibility to potentially get to that point. And I think that Penn State has built a program in the last couple of years, but this year really kind of putting it, you know, to the forefront where they could potentially get into that mix. But the conversation was fair about James Franklin saying, you know, he's not winning games against top 10 teams. Well, whether you think that SMU and Boise State are in those tiers or not, the likelihood is they're probably not. They were two top 10 teams heading into those matchups. So all of a sudden he goes from one win against top 10 teams to 3 wins against top 10 teams, which, you know, his overall record still is not very good, but he's putting together a winning season and a winning culture with this organization and with this program that kind of says, you can build off this. This is a building block year. And if Drew Aller does come back like he says he's going to, and if Nick Singleton and Katron Allen do both return, you're really, the two guys that you're losing are Abdul Carter and Tyler Warren. Substantial pieces, but I think they've done a good job of putting themselves in a place where they can maybe not entirely one for one replace these guys, but put themselves in like almost a Moneyball aggregate situation where you have two or three guys do the productivity that one guy did the year prior. And I think that they're still going to be a formidable team, again, especially if Drew Aller returns, next year. I think that this is a team that has put themselves in a spot where they were the most they were like the beneficiary of the college football playoff expanding to 12 teams.
Yes,
because
definitely.
if it was even 8, or 12, they would have been in, I believe, 6 of the last 7 years. In the years that, they finished 5 or 7 or 9 or whatever the case may be, they were a massive beneficiary to this. So if James Franklin can say, hey, I've won 2 college football playoff games, I'm knocking on the doorstep of a potential national championship appearance, that's what I can hang my hat on. That's my calling card. Now, all of a sudden, James Franklin, if he wins this game, has 3 top 10 wins in a season, to go along with a Big Ten championship appearance, to go along with winning the Big Ten back in 2016. You're talking about a guy who's, I think, like the idea, the scope of James Franklin nationally will change pretty quickly. Now that you say you've beaten SMU, you've beaten Boise State, you've beaten Notre Dame, and now you have an opportunity to beat either Texas or Ohio State to play to win a national title, something that hasn't happened in almost 40 years at Penn State.
Yeah, and the knocks are still there on James Franklin. The national championship odds are still a little bit steep, and you mentioned the teams they played to get there, but the magnitude of this game, I think, is really important for the university, for the program. And I want to get you 2 quick questions here to finish up that aren't as newsworthy, but one will be on theme. And then one I asked to every guest I've met in sports radio. So Kincaid, Kevin Cooney, bunch of guys have answered it.
Sure.
But first one, give me your best memory of a home game at Happy Valley.
So to me, it's the 4 overtime game against Michigan, the whiteout game. And I forget.
No way you just said that, Tyler. We didn't know each other at the time. That's my answer. We were in the same. We walked by each other in the hallway then and didn't know it.
Yep, it's probably randomly gave each other a fist bump or something or a high five on the way out. But that one to me is the one that stands out. I think it was my junior year. I still to this day can remember that game. Allen Robinson going up. So I guess it must not have been my junior. It must have been my freshman or sophomore year. Allen Robinson going up and making the play, scoring the touchdown late to force overtime, going to the 4 overtime periods, and then the rushing touchdown at the end, bounce to the outside, kicks to the left. Penn State wins that game. That to me is my lasting memory of, because, for me, like, I was at Penn State during a period of, difficulty for the football program.
Sure,
because
the fallout, right?
Yeah, because of everything that had happened in years prior. So they were limited scholarships. There was a lot of players that had left. It was a lesser talented team. That to me is the game that was like, hey, this was still an organization. Like, personally, I could look at this as a kind of a staple win for a team that wasn't nearly as good as they've now gotten themselves to be in the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's a great one, especially with Hackenberg and Robinson. They hit a peak there. Maybe people don't think back on it that positively with Hackenberg, but that really was a great game, at least for one day. And I'll get you one final question, my sports radio prompt here. It's pick one team from any era of Philadelphia sports. Can be 5 years, maybe 10, and even one season if you really want it to be. Look back on how that era captivated Philadelphia in your memory and tell the story the way you remember it.
Yeah, I think to me, the one that stands out for me is the 2010 Flyers. Because me, I'm a baseball guy. Probably hockey falls lower on the order for me than most other sports do. Baseball and football are my top 2. I will be open and honest about my hockey knowledge compared to some of the other sports. That 2010 Flyers team captivated me in a way that like propelled me into being a hockey fan for the first time, because you can remember that season going back to having to beat Henrik Lundqvist on the final day of the year to get into the playoffs, and these surmounting odds of Brian Boucher versus Henrik Lundqvist in a shootout, and the Flyers win the game. I'll never forget Ali Jokinen, getting stopped by Boucher to get into the postseason. And then the draw that you get as the 7 seed in that first round when you play a Jersey team that you felt like you were capable of beating. They had their number for a majority of the year. They beat Jersey. Then they go on in the incredible 7-game comeback against Boston. They're the higher seed in the Eastern Conference Finals against Montreal. They beat up on Montreal, and they get to a Stanley Cup with a rotating carousel of goaltenders and, a really potent group of goal scorers at the top. And it was just a team that really captivated me for the first time as a Flyers fan, because there were better teams across Philadelphia. You talk about like the 04 Eagles and the 11 Phillies, teams that didn't win championships but were really, really good. That 2010 Flyers team has such a special place in my heart, because they were the first team really that made me go, man, I love this game. And I never felt that way about hockey the way I did about baseball and football until that team. And so to me, 2010 always has a captivating factor of just really pulling me in to be a hockey fan truly for the first time as I think I was probably 16, 17, I think, when that team made its run. So it was just like a really good time in my formative teenage years to really become a hockey fan.
That's a great answer. And once again, anybody who's listening going to be able to tell that we're close in age, because I've talked about that team at such great length on this show. And I think you mentioned the 04 Eagles. My answer to my own question is just the Reed McNabb era collectively. Sure. So Tyler, thanks so much for coming on, spending a few minutes at a busy time when Penn State is in one of their most critical games in the past, I don't know, maybe even couple of decades. So check out Tyler's work on allphly.com, and we'll get you a link to the PHLY Penn State show in the show notes. Thanks a lot, Tyler.
Colin, I appreciate it. Always got time for you.
It was great to catch up with Tyler Zulli a few minutes. He's just a book of knowledge on college football altogether, and with the semifinal round coming into such a funny dynamic that way, it was the perfect time to bring on Tyler, a former 97.5 The Fanatic producer and now a great podcast host over at All PHLY. That's going to do it for this week. Thanks for listening, Philadelphia.